In the last video, I showed you how to deal with event listeners and all the different types of events you're going to run into, and I mentioned that there's a slight difference between normal functions and arrow functions that we can finally talk about, now that we have these event listeners to deal with. So to get started, I just have this simple button here, nothing else, just a button on the page, and we're going to select that button, so we'll say const button is equal to document.query selector of the button. This gives us the button on our page. And I want to here add an event listener for the click event. And we're just going to run a function with E. And inside of here, this is an arrow function. Let's do the exact same thing. We're going to add an event listener on click. But this time I want to do a normal function, just a normal anonymous function, which is going to take in E. And now we have two different functions. One is a normal function, one is an arrow function, and they both are happening on the click of the button. Now what I want to do is I want to see what this is inside of these, because inside of JavaScript, there's a thing called this. And this just represents essentially the scope that you are inside of, the current scope. That is why, for example, we just come in here, console.log. This is always equal to the window object when you're in the global scope. As you can see, if I save this, you can see we get true in the console because this is essentially the same as the window object. That is why that we don't have to do, window.alert, because it's automatically assumed since this is window. And this is just a keyword that we can use to define the scope that we're currently inside of. Well, this is actually defined differently for arrow functions and normal functions. So let's just say console.log arrow this. And inside of here, we'll just put this. Oops. Let's type this out actually like this, console.log of this. That way we have our arrow this and then this. Let's do the same thing in here, console.log function this, and we'll say console.log of this. So in both of these, the code looks very similar. We're printing out the text function and arrow just to define which one is which, and then we're printing out what this is in each one of these scopes. So let's save, click the function, and you'll see we get arrow this, and then our arrow this defines the same as our window. As you can see, this is just our window, has all of our window properties inside of it. And then our function this is defined as the button itself. So how is it that the keyword here, this, is different between our arrow function and our normal function declaration? Well, the reasoning for this is because arrow functions behave like I would expect. They behave with normal scoping rules. So our arrow function is defined here inside of this global scope where this is equal to the window. So since this is defined where this equals window, inside of this function, the keyword this is going to be the same as outside of where that function was defined, which is exactly what we would expect. With normal function syntax, on the other hand, though this keyword is actually defined based on where the function itself is called. And because of that, this function is called inside of this button because we set up this event listener on the button. So this function, when the event gets fired, is fired from the button itself. That is why this is equal to the button, because it's fired from within the button object. This is really confusing to a lot of people when they're starting out because they'll see this code and they'll see this code up here and think, well, they look exactly the same, but they do different things. And the reasoning for that is normal functions handle this in a really strange way. I personally hate how they handle this. It makes things hard to work with, it's confusing, and again, it breaks those normal rules of scoping that you're used to. So this is why I almost always use arrow functions if I need to use the this keyword. But luckily for you, the this keyword is something you almost never need to use. I recommend really not using this unless you absolutely have to, and if you have to, you'll know when those scenarios come up. But 99% of the time, you won't be using the this keyword. It's just not something you need to worry about. But I needed to mention the differences between arrow functions and normal functions, because if you ever do use this, for example, you see a function like this, and you convert it to an arrow function, it will break because this is two different things in these different functions. This is why if you need to access the current object, in our case, the button, inside of a normal function, I'd recommend just saying e.target instead of this because they're both going to be the same exact thing. Because of the weird scoping issues with normal functions though, I highly recommend you pretty much always use an arrow function instead, as they just don't deal with that function scoping problem, and this is just going to be what you expect it to be, and it's not going to be this weird other thing. And that's all there is about the differences between this in arrow functions and normal functions. I know it's not something you're really ever going to run into, but it may be something you encounter in older code or code that uses this heavily, so it's nice to know the differences because it will lead to bugs in the future. Now in the next video, I want to talk about data attributes a little bit more and how we can use and modify data attributes inside of JavaScript to do some really interesting things.